Hi, good evening, everybody. Welcome to Publics at IIHS. Publics is a platform where we invite scholars and practitioners to come and speak about their work. Today's lecture, which is City as a Classroom, Experiential Learning in the Urban, is being hosted in collaboration with the Knowledge in Action for Urban Equality, or the KNOW project. I will now hand it over to Geetika Anand, who is the moderator for today's panel, and I'll ask her to introduce the talk and the speakers this evening. Geetika is a doctoral researcher at the University of Cape Town. Her work focuses on practice biographies of urban development practitioners in South Africa. She has also been associated with IIHS since 2010 and is currently a researcher on the KNOW project, where she is looking at planning education in Asia and Africa. So over to you, Geetika.
Thanks, Anvi. Hello, everyone. Once again, welcome to this panel discussion on City as a Classroom, Experiential Learning in the Urban. It is second in the series Dialogue with Urban Pedagogues, How Do We Teach, Learn, and Practice Urban Equality, which brings together our work on pedagogy for urban equality under the KNOW project. In this panel, we will particularly focus on the studio or practica or practice project pedagogy in various urban disciplines, such as planning, architecture, urban studies, at both undergraduate and master's level. Those of us who were trained in these disciplines might agree when I say studios occupied a very critical position in our learning journey. A large proportion of our time in and outside the classroom was devoted to these studios, at times even at the expense of theory modules. In a review my colleague Nandini and I conducted of 10 master's level planning programs in Asia and Africa, we observed that studios form the backbone of all these planning programs. They make up close to a third of overall program credits in majority of the programs and constitute an even more critical component in each of the first 2 or 3 semesters until the dissertation component in the final semester. Thus, in thinking through how we teach, learn, and practice urban equality, it is essential that we closely examine the pedagogies of studios and practica. With such a diverse and experienced group of pedagogues in the room today, we hope to bring together reflections from India, Zambia, South Africa, and Peru, and continue this dialogue in the future to learn from each other and further expand the potentials of studios and practica in urban education. I have requested all the speakers to organize their inputs around 3 points. First, to situate their studio in the overall program and institutional context and give an overview of how the studios are carried out. Second, to reflect upon the opportunities and challenges the studio pedagogy offers and what are some of the key enablers and disablers in this process. And third, a discussion on the potential of studio pedagogy to explicitly or implicitly address issues of urban inequality within and through them. Keeping time zones in mind, we'll go east to west. Please keep posting your comments and questions in the Q&A box, and we'll come to them in the end. So just going on to our speakers. Our first speaker is Poonam Prakash, who has an experience of over 30 years in urban planning profession. She is currently a professor at the Department of Physical Planning, School of Planning and Architecture, New Delhi. Having worked at Delhi Development Authority for some time, she has been teaching an undergraduate planning program at SPA for over 25 years and has been instrumental in major revisions of its curriculum. In 2016, she was nominated for the Inspired Teachers Program of the President of India. She has widely published on the topics of low-income housing, participatory planning, planning process, ethics, and planning education. Her recent works include a co-edited book on public participation in planning in India and a co-authored book titled City Planning in India, 1947 to 2017. Over to you, Poonam.
Thank you. Thank you, Geetika, for this invitation and particularly the topic of experiential learning, which is very close to my heart. I'll just kind of share my screen and kind of talk around the points that I have. Okay. Is it visible?
All good, yes.
Okay, thank you. So I think we are in different time zones, so good morning and good evening to whoever is located wherever. So I'm just going to, when Geetika gave me this topic, and so a lot of times in studio, we kind of implicitly and explicitly talk about urban equality, but to be able to conceptualize this for this presentation, it kind of was a complex. For me, it was, just to kind of conceptualize the experience. But I'm glad that I had this opportunity. So what I'm going to, just before I kind of talk about how we are addressing the issues of equality in studio, I'll kind of give a brief context of the program. So School of Planning and Architecture is one of the oldest institute in India, started immediately after independence. It started with the postgraduate programs. Currently, we have 10 postgraduate programs and 2 undergraduate programs. One of that is Bachelor of Planning. So undergraduate program, it was the first program that started in India in 1989. So we are almost about 30 years, little more than 30 years of undergraduate planning program in India. Currently, there are many institutes. So it's a 4-year program, which has, as Geetika said, almost 1/3 of each semester actually goes in studio. And the studio kind of starts from a neighborhood level, in the first year, right up to regional plan in the 4th year. And that's a brief background as to where the studios are located. Also, in postgrad programs, so the undergrad program, the admission is from at a centralized national level joint entrance examination, whereas in the postgrad, it is, from different disciplines, students kind of join in. Just to kind of, it was, this is one of the, this is the SPA, School of Planning and Architecture residential complex. And I just wanted to kind of show this, that we are located in an area which is, this is in Delhi, which kind of where we encounter inequality almost daily. So this is, if you can see, this is a very posh area, New Friends Colony and Maharani Bagh, which is one of the poshest areas in Delhi. Along with it, we have these 2 very dense old settlements, Hyderabad and Temur Nagar, which we in Delhi, we term them as urban villages. And this is a self-organized settlement, which is very close to a drain, which goes and meets the river Yamuna. And this is where we are. And I've always wondered that, and there have been many studies we have done in academics, which kind in our college in this area, which looks at how, different spatial built environment is juxtaposed with each other, and how we encounter differences, and how we, kind of address these issues. This was just to kind of give a context of where we are located. Of course, our main academic building is about 7 to 8 kilometers from this place. From here, I just kind of jump into that studio becomes our core pedagogy, and some of the characteristics in our context continue to be, it's a primarily field work based this thing, but also predominantly, even currently, is the curriculum is predominantly based on the rational comprehensive planning model. It has, of course, very structured group work and formative reviews, which happen every week. Usually the class is divided into groups, and each group end up looking at different sectors of, let's say if it's a master plan problem or a zonal plan level, so each group will look at one sector. And it is expected that there would be some kind of a connect between the theories that the theory subjects that they have studied before, and they would be able to apply that in studio. As I've mentioned earlier, this is that the scale changes from first year to the final year, from neighborhood to region. The main tension that exists in embedding experiential learning in a largely structured and rational comprehensive model approach is that experiential learning is largely unstructured, participatory, dialogical, non-evaluative, process-driven, and reflective, whereas the rational comprehensive model and even the academic structure is bounded, and it is assessment and outcome oriented, usually comparative in relation to other students, wanting to find solutions. So there is this tension that always exists between the experiential learning and the way academic environment is set up. However, of course, the faculty does have the freedom, but we also need to acknowledge that it is embedded into a larger organizational and societal context, to which I come next. This is basically, if we want to talk about experiential understanding of equality, while in cognitive understanding of equality, there is a lot of discussion that happen in theory subjects. We have number of theory subjects where cognitively students kind of understand the idea of inequality and how it kind of affects society. But the experiential understanding, where the translating experience into experiential learning, begs two questions that we need to answer. That how do I construct my own experience as a teacher? How do I see myself as an instrument of change? And which is not a very comfortable position to be in. And how do I facilitate students' experience and change, convert them into learning? So construction of experience, is a complex interplay of the individual sense making and the institutional and situational context and the social context. And I think each one of us kind of develop our own experiences based on this interplay, and how I frame my own experience of reality is dependent on how my institution sees the core, the core to the idea of equality is how do I see the notions of hierarchy, authority, and power? How do I look at the balance between freedom and discipline, and how my curriculum is structured? Similarly, in social context, where education is more seen as an instrumental rather than, serving an instrumental purpose rather than intrinsic purpose, which I think Freire calls also the banking model of education, where the idea of merit, is kind of contextless, where the social context of students is not kind of embedded into the idea of merit. So these this interplay of these three kind of sets each institute in its own way how they construct an experience of equality. So taking this kind of little further, if I look at how in studio this experience gets constructed, so there is this contradiction where we are, the whole methodology is in the studio is predominantly rational planning model. The studios are organized around that survey analysis plan, which has a tendency to homogenize the diverse experiences and bring them into a more simplistic categories. So in that, to bring in the diverse experiences that students have, or also the diverse experience of the communities that students go to, becomes a bit of a challenge, which sometimes as individual studio faculty, like for example, I introduced the idea of looking at how, talking to different communities, and how we kind of try and understand issues from what they have said rather than doing a simple questionnaire, this thing. But it does remain a challenge, and quite a big challenge, because all other studios can kind of continue to be dominated by a rational planning model. Similarly, in planning discussions in the studios, faculty, including myself to some extent, is comfortable talking about class. The planning documents also to some extent do talk about class. However, intersectionality of other identities like religion, caste, gender, still there is some discussion that kind of is now happening, but around religion and caste, people are still not comfortable. They are neither trained, faculty is neither trained to discuss those this complexity and these intersectionalities. So those discussions become very very quantitative in their approach. And finally, in studios, there is a focus on outcome rather than process, both in the terms of structure of assessment and the way, we look at the idea of what is right and wrong, the mistakes, how mistakes are interpreted. So these are some of the concerns through which the experience of studio can construct inequalities in the experience of the studio. So this was just, now I come to how the inequalities get constructed in studio. So the first point is which is continuing from the idea of merit that is kind of socially constructed, that the social context of faculty and students, we attempt to make it contextless. We say people, once they come to the college, they need to have a certain level of comprehension and competence. And we then bring them into these categories of weak and intelligent students without really looking at the hardships or their social backgrounds and the kind of resources and opportunities that they may have had prior to coming to college. And that leads to, in the group formation, it creates its own hierarchies, and certain students kind of get excluded. It also privileges confident English-speaking students, which leads certain other students to not really speak much. So, of course, as faculty, we kind of give attention to these things, but still, as a process, some of these processes kind of are inherent in the way studio gets structured, and individual uniqueness kind of is there. Time? Okay, 12 minutes up. Oh, wow. Okay, let me just let me just come to the last slide and sorry. Where I'm just discussing certain experiences and possibilities. And so in experiences, like I don't think we'll have time to go through this, but I think the key points that we need to really take into account is the faculty-student relationship, the problem design, and the real-life engagement. How there were some examples that we have, and then the kind of spaces of dialogue that we create around values, and particularly re-examining the notion of merit and assessment. And so we can take some of these issues in the discussion, and I think with this I kind of end my presentation. And so thank you.
Thank you so much, Poonam. Having done the program myself almost 2 decades back, it's really special for me actually to reflect on this in this forum. I'm sure we can come back to some of those examples that you were speaking about in the discussion, because I think they're really helpful in thinking through this. But I'll now hand over to Gilbert. Gilbert Siame holds a master's as well as a PhD in city and regional planning from the University of Cape Town. He's a lecturer and researcher in the Department of Geography and Environmental Studies at the University of Zambia, where he also co-founded and coordinates the Center for Urban Research and Planning. Gilbert has led and co-led several international urban research projects on cities and has published widely on topics of urban informality, decentralization, service delivery, and so on. He was an international fellow at the UCT under the Urban Studies Foundation International Fellowship Program for 2021. Over to you, Gilbert.
Thank you, Geetika, and thank you to everyone for coming and being part of the conversation. I apologize on one thing. I had a power surge, so my internet is disrupted. I'm connecting via a phone, so I'll not, I don't think I'll last using a video. I apologize for that, but I'm sure the audio will work out. I have been introduced, thanks Geetika for the kind introduction. I am based in Zambia, and I'm based in the Department of Geography and Environmental Studies, which is in the School of Natural Sciences. Maybe that speaks on the context partly. We in the university, and particularly myself, have been involved in both designing and teaching of delivering the Master of Science in Spatial Planning at the University of Zambia. It is a program that was formulated and approved by the university, largely to address one major problem, the problem of lack of well-trained human resource to undertake planning in Zambia and maybe in the region as well. So the university came up with this program with support from University of Cape Town, where I did my PhD, and with full support from the Association of African Planning Schools. And so essentially what we've been implementing is a model curriculum of the Association of African Planning Schools. And in there are certain unique things. The first thing is it's a curriculum that responds to the needs of Zambian cities and towns, and essentially African cities and towns, and by extension, the Global South. And what are the unique things? Firstly, is the emphasis on use of live projects through the studio methodology to train our graduates. And the program is at master's level. The second part is the program has no 3-hour theoretical exams. We train our students and assess them using practical projects. And there's a strong emphasis on the need to balance between theory and practice. So our studio project is a very outstanding and very emphasized methodology, our studio projects. Our studio projects are done at 3 scales. It's the local area scale, the city or citywide scale, and the regional scale. Apparently, this is how the planning law and planning practice in the country is actually structured. Local, which is community, city level, district level, and then the region. The studio project run in across the year. That's term 1, semester 1, and semester 2. And we consider the studio project as the melting point of ideas in terms of thinking about cities of tomorrow, and also in terms of training well inserted graduates in the context of the environment they work in. We emphasize in terms of the actual design, we implement the studio project and studio teaching alongside 2 major actors. The first one is the local government, which is the local authority. In this case, we usually work with the Lusaka City Council. And then we work with the local alliance of the Slum Dwellers International and other community groupings. And the project exclusively is actually explicitly stated but it shall focus on an informal settlement. So ideas of inequality, ideas of inequality, ideas of urban informality are very core to the program and exclusively addressed in the Studio A project. Suffice to say, there are other theoretical programs like Planning for Urban Transition that seek to theoretically orient the students on these matters of addressing urban informality. How do we practically get going? The first thing that I should mention in our Studio project, which we use as a site for transformation, is there is emphasis in our teaching and in our design thinking on the need to balance in orienting our students between experiential knowledge, lived experience in communities, and theoretical academic knowledge that is in books. We try to balance the two. And why do we balance the two? We allow the students to continuously experiment while they are reading and hearing from our classrooms in terms of other courses into the studio, so that they are able to critique what is being offloaded to them and what they are coming across in the books. And in so doing, there is a bidirectional flow of ideas and experiences from both theory to practice and from practice to theory. This gets really entertaining, exciting, and transformational in the mindset, because in most cases, we do have sessions in literally every phase of our studio project. We do have people from the communities that sit in and actually teach the students. So if we talk of a good city, if we talk of a right to the city, if we talk of service delivery, yes, they'll read in the books. They'll read papers by Susan Feinstein and other authors. But then a grandmother from the community, a youth from the community, will now offer the ideas. What does that really mean, living in a city that is 70% informal and people actually going by through informal practices? And that allows the students to work themselves in a manner that can be transformational in many ways. Then we again move on and emphasize in our teaching the idea of power, the idea of empowerment, and the issues of local governance. And in our studio, we believe we need to engage with issues of systemic change, gender issues, youth, youth being left out in the development discourses and processes, and we put in and try to challenge manipulation in the way we teach them. But when you are a city planner, you will be faced with power inequalities, dysfunctional governance systems, preferential treatment of certain groupings in society. And when we call in experts like the Anti-Corruption Commission for Zambia to come and speak to our students, they bring in how these issues are actually real on the ground. And then how students actually need to experiment to learn how to address these inequalities in the community. Our thinking and our teaching and the way we expose our students is to understand that empowerment might have no end. Empowerment has multiple meanings. And societies, so what we call community or what we call society is diverse. There are multiple interests, each pulling in different directions, and planning is going to be implemented in that context. It is those structures that planning needs to engage with in order to achieve systemic change and transformational interventions that can actually begin to make a difference in the community. And these ideas, students express them in form of lines, in form of creative drawings, and we're increasingly now even trying to use expressions in form of cartoons, drawings, videos, really trying to act up and try to find ways to actually communicate and engage with power structures and power bases that in many cases can be manipulative. Ideas of justice, ideas, and how we can actually make that a possibility. So this is when we teach planning, law and governance and talk of justice, inclusion, participation, the studio becomes a melting point upon which to test these ideas. And don't forget, it is in an informal settlement. Then the other principles that we advance to make our students ready for the future when they are graduates is we promote lifelong learning in our teaching, and in our case, when we use lifelong learning, we look at from the time the student enters the classroom to the time the student leaves the university as a graduate. How has the student transitioned? What are the questions the student has raised, and how has these questions been answered? And so we promote use of journals, recording individual experiences, individual growth points, and individual challenges. And that journal is actually graded so that learning and transition begins with the individual, begins with a high level of consciousness about urban inequalities and the duty of the planner, the duty that planners are called upon to perform in our cities. And so use of a journal, writing theory papers based on what they have learned over time, and drawing on relevant theoretical positioning, all that helps us to graduate students that are well geared to address the current and future challenges. And I want to transition to a few points on challenges. We teach these studio courses and use studio methodologies in a context of highly unequal urban spaces, also in a context of high resource constrained environments. And so challenges are real. And what are these challenges? First of all, we admit students from multiple backgrounds, from journalism to development studies to economics to architecture to geography to urban planning and many other fields. Our curriculum is really open. And we do that essentially to allow for cross-pollination of ideas and multiple perspectives to challenge the orientation that might be historical. But that in itself comes into the challenge. We ought to start from some minimum baseline, and we may not have all the opportunity and the chance to actually get every student to the destination they need to reach. Second, facilitating a studio project, a studio process can be very demanding on the part of the facilitator. And in a program like where I teach on, there are very, very few people with adequate skills, capacities, experience, and a certain degree of sacrifice to actually teach in the community and allow community people to actually sit in the classroom and participate. So facilitation resources are very limited. And if you are going to think of using a studio methodology to transition our thinking and our engagement with the city, we ought to look at how we actually resource that in many parts of the world. And the other aspect is the space. We are very creative in the way we deliver it. People need to sometimes sit on the floor. People sometimes need to just, have conversations. But spaces are not always there. And I want to conclude by saying that in our teaching and assessment, we look at studio as a platform for raising self-awareness. As I conclude, we use studio as a platform for challenging ideas and rethinking the cities of tomorrow. Our studio is used as a site for critical interrogation and innovation to challenge urban inequalities and challenge the forces and structures that have created the urban inequalities over time. And we look at the studio as a point for building teams and the capacity of graduates to actually work together. And finally, we are limited and we continue to be limited and need to think around how we implement a studio pedagogy in a very rigid university environment. And universities are rigid in many parts of the world. And also how we transition studio teaching in an era where required mostly to work online. Those are new evolving issues that we need to engage with in our work. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Gilbert. That was really interesting. I think one of the first points that you made, like how your studios are linked to planning law and practice, that itself is like so telling. Like you need to work in a certain structure, but then you try to innovate within that. So that and I think another point that I want to pick on, and which is sort of different from the undergrad studio that we saw that Poonam spoke about, because therein everybody is like sort of starting fresh, so you don't actually have that advantage of multiple disciplines. But what I'm hearing is there are also like these challenges that come with multiple disciplines, and like putting you in a position where you start. So that's really interesting. So thank you so much, and I'm sure we'll come back to some of these points in the discussion. So just moving on to our next speakers, they are Anna Selmeczi and Heeten Bhagat. Anna's urban studies research is grounded in social and political theory and focuses on the connections between orders of urban space and knowledge production, and how various forms of popular politics contest and change these orders. Extending these themes through the lens of her teaching practice over the last few years, she is also thinking about the transformative and even emancipatory possibilities of pedagogical and research methods that emerge through creative experimentation. Anna received her PhD in political science at the Central European University in 2012. She's based at the African Center for Cities at the University of Cape Town, where she's a senior lecturer and the convener of the Southern Urbanism Master's Program, and the pedagogical lead of the Urbanisms from the South track of Critical Urbanism's MA. Heeten Bhagat was born in Zimbabwe. Presently, he oscillates between Harare, Cape Town, and any place that involves long distance travel. Most recently, his work has been in the emerging terrain of pracademics, essentially looking to expand collaborations and design experiments between academia and real life systems. He approaches this work as a methodologist, bringing pragmatic and provocative programming to support decolonial and diversity expanding processes in overlooked and underserved environments. His experience across learning spectrum recommends him into these spaces in formation that are looking to engage dissonance as a way to activate pathways towards inspired productivities. Over to you guys.
Thank you so much, Geetika. And thank you for the invitation, and thank you for including us in this array of studio practices. It's really lovely to see the differences and many commonalities. And yeah, just I was taking notes of those points of convergences as others were speaking. So I'm going to share my screen and start by giving you all the context of our studio. I hope you can see. Of course, it didn't start where I wanted it to start. Here we go. We will speak about, Heeten and I will speak about the module of the overall studio element of our course work in the program Masters in Southern Urbanism that is based at the African Center for Cities and hosted by two faculties. But this is ACC's first taught Masters, soon to be joined by another program. So our year-long practical course is the City Research Studio, which is composed of 4 different modules. And the one that we will speak about today and that Heeten and I have been co-facilitating over the last three years now is the second element. And thankfully on this panel today, we have the experts for the first module, Sophie Oldfield and Geetika Anand, who if that comes up, will be able to speak to City Research Studio 1. But firstly, really, I wanted you all to have an idea of how the City Research Studio, this year-long practical course, fits into our curriculum. aside from it, we have 3 core seminars, and the idea for the studio really is to more or less loosely speak to these core courses. So City Research Studio 1, which is centered around the lived experience of housing policy and focuses on the collaborative, on how we co-produce research with communities of struggle. Sorry, I lost my train of thought. Yes, that corresponds to our core seminar, Urban Everyday, and City Research Studio 2, which we will speak about in more detail, much more loosely, but it still corresponds to our core seminar, Urban Theory. And then in a recent redesign of one element, or well, actually 2 elements of our curriculum, our 3rd core course, Curating Urban Regulation, corresponds quite closely to City Research Studio 3, which is the life and times of policy artifacts. And you, if you have participated in the previous session, Edgar Peters spoke about that 3rd studio, so I can refer you to that one. And here are some snapshots from CRS 3 and last year's outputs. And I especially love this poster, which is a fictional campaign for one of our students to become mayor, just to push the imaginative agenda. So this is the context, and I think before I hand over to Heeten, who will speak in detail about what we've done over the last 4 years, I just wanted to say that our studio, as you can see from some of these artifacts coming out of it, I think it's significant where it's placed in the sequence. We follow from CRS1, which is very real in a way, in terms of exposing students to what it means to be an urban practitioner in the face of the imperative of intervening into the very unequal housing reality of Cape Town. And then they are forced to engage with Heeten and I. And what we really aim in every year to do is to invite them to play with us and let loose and let go of the very diverse, and I want to underscore that to resonate with what Gilbert was just saying about the diversity of the student body. So to let go of their very diverse learned disciplinary skill sets and ways of thinking, and to use arts-based methodologies, quite broadly speaking, to be able to play and experiment and learn, or at least start to think with working with the abstract. And I think this is the point, Heeten, I hope this was a good cue for you to take it from here and give everyone a bit more detail about the content and mode of facilitation of our studio. And then in the end, hopefully we'll have the time, we want to go back to some of the prompts that we got about enabling and disabling context. Thank you. I forgot to time myself, but Heeten, I hope you still have some time.
I think it's fine. Thank you, Anna. And yeah, thank you for everybody who invited us here. And then maybe we could just stick on that last slide. I think as a kind of picture, as a kind of image, it's really great. I think it kind of brings together a couple of things.
Okay.
So yeah, yeah, with Anna, we kind of run this very particular studio it's been running for the last 5 years. I was working for an arts-based organization. I'm not an urban scholar traditionally. I come from a kind of more sort of performance, speculative, queer theory, queer kind of terrain. And the idea behind this was we were approached by, well, how this came about, we were approached by Professor Edgar Peterson when this course was put together, when this master's was put together. And the idea of kind of looking at the urban through an arts-based lens, as Anna was saying, but partly also to see what kinds of stretching can we do to the teaching and the kind of learning of urban studies, specifically from the kind of global south. So the first studio, what we did is which was the kind of pilot, we looked at the city through 4 particular films. 2 films from an African filmmaker called Jibril Mambeti. So that was Tukibuki and Ien. We then kind of looked at a film that was made by Wim Wenders, a German filmmaker, called A Notebook on City and Clothes, which was kind of an extended interview with Yoji Yamamoto, a Japanese fashion designer. And then we looked at Of Time and the City, a Terence Davies film. We asked the students to think about their understanding of the city through these films and what was that? What was the work that had to get done? From there, we moved into looking at the city. So that was the first year, that was in 2018. In 2019, what we did is kind of looked at the city through very particular marks. So one of the things that we were quite curious about, kind of an extension of the desire line kind of theory, specifically looking at islands and edges in the city where you saw kind of tire marks. And we were wondering what it was about, what was the negotiation that was happening between the kind of planning and how the city was being used, at what point were they kind of rubbing and touching against each other. The year after that, we kind of extended further and invited 4 kind of practitioners to talk about their sense of the city through dance, public art, kind of street lighting in a way, the kind of art of street lighting, and then kind of sociological context. From there, we pushed even further. The year after that, in 2020, the studio was titled This Is Stupid, which you can see the kind of little image of it there. And the idea behind that was that, there were counter studies that done in and around the city of Cape Town that understood the kind of prevalence and the kind of ongoing legacy of apartheid era planning laws. And so what we found was that a lot of these studies kind of unpack the kind of logics of them and take you to the point of understanding that, they don't make sense. But we found very little that kind of projected out of that sense of it didn't make sense. So we decided to kind of look at the city through an absurd lens, an absurdist lens, and ask the students to look at particular policies and declare them absurd. And what would that mean? What were the opportunities in absurdity and absurd kind of framing? 10 minutes up. Okay. The year after that, we kind of looked at the city through 3 particular things: marks, layers, and gestures. It was called the sum and the parts. What does the city speak back to you in terms of how it gets used? And this year, what we're doing is working on the kind of the title of this year's course is called Exercising Imaginations. And the aim is to help the students think about building a toolkit to imagine. So what tools are required to imagine the city in other ways? I'm going to round it off there, but please contact us if you want to know more, because we would like to speak a little bit about speaking to Geetika's 2 further prompts. So I'll go back to Anna.
Thank you. Very quickly, I don't think we have a lot of time, and I'm sorry if I took too much by contextualizing the studio, but speaking back to also what Poonam was saying, and I think she gave us such a good outline for these enablers and disablers. In particular, we wanted to speak about how one assesses a studio like this, which is always such an interesting, at points frustrating, not between the two of us, but frustrating towards the institution. How do you attach a number to a studio or the processes, the learnings of a studio like this? How do you enumerate the learning that results from it? And sometimes there's no learning resulting from it, and so how do you assess that? So I don't know if we have the time, but very briefly, I want to say that it's how we do it, Heeten and I, is a conversation between the two of us, and the main questions that always come up, although they might change year to year, is to what extent or how far did students push themselves? And some years we actually ask students themselves to please tell us how far you think you pushed yourself. And that's accompanied by a couple other questions. And then in our conversation, we end up with a number. But, and this has been confirmed by our external examiners. So it fits the institution, but we also think that it fits what we want to achieve. I'll stop and sorry, thank you.
I just want to say one thing. It's very interesting because if we could, and sort of ethically, maybe it isn't such a good idea, but we do look at students' faces at the beginning of each of the studios. And that sense of bewilderment is beautiful. And we look at the students at the end, or the students look back at us at the end of the studios, and oftentimes there's this really kind of beautiful sense of assuredness that they've tried something. They've tried something and played. Yeah, it's rewarding in very interesting ways. Thank you very much for the space, Geetika and Tanvi.
Thanks, Anna. Thanks, Heeten. Given how much confused I was during this studio 4 years back, I'm really intrigued by this conversation and how it has evolved, since then. Because as we are like officially guinea pigs of the program, it's nice to see how this particular studio has evolved, and it has changed quite a bit since then. Yeah, I think one of the reasons why I really wanted this studio to be part of this conversation was to also, break it up, like, we like in terms of our methods, and as SPA's example around rational planning, and also it's quite, at least for me, it was, and that's where hence the confusion. It was quite a novel sort of studio, and I thought that this is useful to, like, just opening up in either at an undergrad or a master's level. So that's, I think that's really great. Yeah, thank you so much. And then I hope that towards the end we can have some more reflections around that. Okay, and going on to Belen now. I hope you had a cup of coffee by now, Belen. Sorry for waking you up so early. Belen Desmason is an architect and urban designer currently teaching and conducting research at the Pontifical Catholic University of Peru. Sorry, I chose the English name. She's also a doctoral researcher in human geography at Durham University. She's the coordinator of CASA, an action research project which explores settlement relocation in the Amazon rainforest. She's also the Latin America and the Caribbean monitoring and evaluation coordinator of GRIP, a research project that focuses on resilience with a special emphasis on gender responsive infrastructure, seeking to understand and enhance people's resilience to shocks and support the development of more sustainable infrastructure in all its diverse forms. Belen is also a fellow No researcher and was the city lead in Lima. Over to you, Belen.
Thank you, everyone, for inviting me to this presentation. I will have a more practical approach, an experimental approach to teaching within the framework of No. So it really allowed us to explore how to engage with the issue of urban inequality through different modules throughout the undergraduate career. It's a 5-year program, and it's divided between urbanism studios and architecture studios, and I teach the urban design studios. So the first one focuses on the local level, kind of like similar to Gilbert, the second one at the district level, and the third one at the metropolitan level. And we also engage with summer workshops, which are of different themes, really. It has gone from architectural history. In this case, we organized one specifically to continue to explore urban inequality. And then we also have, as a mandatory course or module, the necessity for students to take internships, whereas that is in an office or in an ongoing research project. So we have had students that only took one of the three, and some students that engage in all three aspects. And the idea was to move from a conceptual understanding of what inequality was to a more in practice processes of co-production with communities and municipalities alike. As I was saying, this project was framed within No. I think our faculty is quite open on engaging in research through teaching, and allows us a lot of freedom in ways in which we engage with ongoing research projects in our own modules. So they change constantly in main themes, although like the idea is always to prepare students to be able to engage, to mix theory and practice. So I have to acknowledge that I do not teach by myself. There's a large group of people involved, from researchers, but also our research assistants in the project were very much engaged, especially in the internship modules and in the preparation for the summer workshop, Limapolis 2020, which happened right before COVID, like the first week of March, and then we got into lockdown in the third week. So the Urban Design Studio, which we've taught in 2019 till 2021, sought to understand new understandings or ways of representing inequality, and to come up with strategies at the metropolitan scale to challenge inequalities. We decided to work on what we call a biopsy, so a fragment of the city that went from the very less affluent areas to the peripheries of the city, to understanding that Lima as a city metropolis of 10 million people is quite difficult to grasp as a concept, and also challenging geopolitical differentiations between different districts. So we created our own fragment district that went through wealthy areas to the peripheries, trying to understand it. And this idea of also the importance of representation, how to move beyond more technical aspects of both architecture, graphics, and urbanism aspects, into finding ways in which to create our own understandings of students' understandings of inequality. So for instance, the idea of seeing ways, this is all in Spanish, sorry, it's our language, but different ways in which people living in the city engage with different times, how many times they have to change public transport to reach certain areas, or the different exposures to risk, for instance, or the different levels of water consumption. I think like in South Africa, it's also like a big deal, but like more affluent districts have a lot more availability of water, and they pay way less for liters than people in the peripheries. And also like a more symbolic aspects of inequality from like the very architectural urban design level of like in Lima, which is a desert city, basically green areas mean wealth as people have more access to water, and how that dilutes over time. And also like in the quality of urban infrastructure and furniture. So the idea was to engage with our understanding of inequality from like very abstract levels of quantitative data into the very lived experiences of it. And how then to engage with inequality at a metropolitan scale, from emerging from very abstract ideas, the idea of, for instance, protecting urban valleys, increasing mobility, engaging with the upgrading of slums, but then how that is turned into practice. And then they came up with different typologies of intervention, not only dealing with, let's say, acting on more marginal areas or the peripheries, but also engaging in transforming more consolidated of the city so that they are more open and available for everyone in the city and not so exclusionary. So this idea on the peripheries of working on how to mitigate risk on I'm sorry, my English at this time in the morning is on the hillside, and engaging with, let's say, more architectural, also levels of interventions. So we went like from a variety of scales throughout, right? So we also worked on the valley side, working more on infrastructure, public infrastructure, and accessibility to it. And then we went into that more theoretical, limited engagement with communities and municipalities into the summer workshop. We worked engaging with CBOs and NGOs, engaging with practices to improve living conditions and claiming rights to the city. So again, we still worked on this biopsy, this fragment. We went to the sites and engaged with different actors working in the areas. But we also invited international guests and public and local experts to sort of continue to have the discussion on what inequality meant, different practices that were already taking place to engage with it, and then how in a short period of time, the workshop lasts 10 days, can you start to engage with quick, more local interventions. We will soon will be publishing both the results of the workshop itself and also the some essays written by the panelists in the seminars. And then the internships went into actually working on the co-production, or to implementing some of the strategies that we're working on. So this also happened in the context of COVID-19. So how to really recognize the main priorities and the emergency situation in Lima, particularly leading with food insecurity, and how to bring it back to the discussions on urban inequality. So responding to rapidly changing circumstances and specific needs, moving beyond the representations of everyday experiences and struggles, and into the co-production of spatial strategies to improve living conditions. So this is like really challenging undergraduate architecture students to see ways in which they can communicate more technical aspects of both architecture and urbanism into easy to understand ways, and also engaging with social media and preparing. The use of WhatsApp was really extensive in this case. So like all of our materials and graphics and engagement was made so they could be seen in a mobile device, and expanding our understandings of architecture and design, by moving beyond formal elements and into the social management of the infrastructures that were implemented. So with COVID-19, as in most cases, we see that there is a differentiated impact on the level of death per capita, depending on if on where you are located. So most wealthy districts like Miraflores and San Isidro had like almost very low cases of death, whereas the more marginal areas like San Juan de Lurigancho, which is one of the poorest districts in Peru, had like one of the highest death rates probably in the world. So again, understanding that food insecurity was a rising concern. So we moved into engaging with our partners in the marginal areas, understanding the history of community kitchens at first, and seeing ways in which those actions that emerge during emergency times can be sustained over time through the co-production of infrastructure. So went to co-producing community kitchens, working in more specific local areas, led a series of workshops, virtual conversations with communities, with a network of community kitchens that rose throughout Lima, and also our partner NGOs. The idea, again, of not going directly into the architectural scale, but engaging with a more urban design or urban scale by dealing with a system of food security that not only involved the kitchens, but also food preparation and the treatment of resources and like solar energy, but also like food leftovers and how they can engage with food agriculture, for instance. And then again, the methodology, we had to move between Zoom conversations, but also some very few face-to-face meetings throughout the pandemic. Now in 2022 and at the end of 2021, we've been able to more fully engage with face-to-face meetings for this kind of events of like understanding and giving a voice to the communities to speak for what their necessities were and also how to organize themselves to bring about the sustainability of the food kitchens in the long term. And then how that led to the creation at the architectural scale of modules that could be replicated and adapted in different areas. And this was a work that we carried on with the Ministry of Housing and also with the Municipality of Lima to see how those particular experiences in this district in San Juan de Lurigancho could be replicated not only in other areas of the peripheries of Lima, but in overall at the national scale in other food kitchens that emerge in other cities. So we work on the kitchen module, how to also lower the levels of contamination by respiratory diseases, but working with wood. Also, I don't know if how am I doing with time? I hope I'm
It's up, but if you can take a minute to.
Oh yeah, sure. I'll just go through really quickly, like storing, also engaging with how to call this in English, urban agriculture again, and just some of I'll go really quickly with some of the implementations that we carried out. So this was one of the community kitchens, some of the workshops that we did. And I think it's really, for me, going back to my status as a student, I would have loved to have this opportunity to engage throughout the process of like from the very beginning, understanding at the theoretical level to finishing with an actual architectural implementation. So yeah, I'll just go through like some of the construction processes of the work. This is what like a public bathroom that we installed in an already existing kitchen. Yeah, I just engaged. And again, we will be publishing some of these experiences both at the food kitchens at the local market that we work on. So that will be all. Thank you. I'm sorry for going a little bit over time.
No, thank you so much, Belen. That was fascinating. I really like that idea of biopsy. I think that's really going forward, and especially these connected opportunities and projects that you also mentioned. You know, you would have liked as a student to engage with this reality of urban inequalities is so useful and also so in some ways so fulfilling as a student. So really, thank you so much for sharing. I have a lot of like thoughts and questions going through my head, but I'll first request our discussant, Sophie Oldfield, to respond to all the contributions. And after that, we'll also take up some of the questions in the Q&A. So please start populating if you have any. Sophie Oldfield is the chair of and a professor in the Department of City and Regional Planning at Cornell University, and affiliated with the Department of Environmental and Geographical Science at the University of Cape Town. Previously, she was the University of Basel, University of Cape Town Professor of Urban Studies, based at the African Center for Cities and in Urban Studies at Basel. Sophie is internationally recognized for research on Southern urbanism through her theoretical and empirical research to substantiate political practice and everyday urban geographies. She has a track record of excellence in collaborative research practice, challenging how academics work in and between university and community. Commitment to this collaborative approach lies at the heart of her research, teaching, and writing on cities of the Global South. Over to you, Sophie.
Thank you. It's so nice to be here and to be part of this conversation. I have to rewrite my bio into some friendly version because I did offer that to you, and listening to it is just too much. So sorry about that. But yeah, it's really wonderful to be here with Anna and Heeten, so two very dear colleagues, with Geetika, a dear colleague. And it's really nice to be part of the conversation with Gilbert and with Belen and Poonam as well. So I think this is such a great conversation. I've just started a new position. I'm about 12 weeks into it, and there are so many assumptions about practice. You know, it's so interesting coming into I'm coming into a planning department. I haven't traditionally taught in a planning department. I've taught in urban studies, and everybody's like, yes, practice. And the way people where I am now speak about practice, and the way we are speaking about practice, there's of course loads of texture to this conversation, but this is a context where this conversation is the context where I really feel at home. Why do I feel at home in it? Well, first of all, I just think there's so many stories to tell. There's so much in the detail of what each of you are doing, of what I've been doing, of what the specificities of the cases. So, I mean, we heard elements of this all over from, I've messed up already, but isn't this stupid? You know, from the name of Heeten and Anna, of your provocative naming of each of those times that you've done your practice, to the image, Gilbert, that you gave me of you know, a grandma or a young person in a Lusaka informal settlement, actually having an interrogation with Susan Feinstein. You know, you know, what are you talking about when you talk about that good and just city? You know, maybe there's beautiful points of conversion, maybe, you know, maybe there's not. To Belen, you know, yeah, there's just so much in the wealth of what you gave us. There's so many stories to be told in both the COVID pandemic era work that you've done, but all those layers. And I think there's, I think Poonam, you put it so provocatively, like how experiential learning sits in a juncture with, and sometimes against, I mean, you were all speaking about this, but with this, what in your context is this comprehensive model of planning? I think that's what I'm meeting in my new job, this notion of a very particular form of physical planning and urban design that's so imperative. And so I think what jumped out at me in all of this work is the need to really tell the stories of what we are doing, to write them, to tell them, and to articulate them in their diversity, in their complexity, in their layers, in their disciplinary stories and their disciplinary unlearnings. You know, I think Heeten and Anna, you gave us a beautiful challenge. We have very powerful ways and powerful visualizations, powerful narratives, powerful theoretical stories for thinking and engaging urban inequality, for seeing it in the city, for locating our studios in particular places. And yet when we do that, we are challenged and we're inspired in all sorts of ways. So I think that's an element which is so important, and both the beauty of this sort of conversation and the beauty of bringing these varied cases, contexts, but also disciplinary insertions, institutional insertions of where we situate practice in our curricula, and in our own journeys, in our imaginations of our students' journeys and the learning that we're aiming for them to grapple with. I think there's a beautiful terrain of the output. You know, we have such an insufficient word for the stuff that we produce. Stuff is equally insufficient, but you know, what are the genres of what we are producing? And we could see that in across presentations. I'm sure, Poonam, if you had more time to share, you would give us loads of texture, but even where you started us off with the juncture of the residential, you know, SPA's residential place and the neighborhoods right next to it, the situatedness of inequality, urban equality and inequality, urban, you know, the disjunctures that are situated in the context in which we're working, but then which we grapple with in our studio designs in so many different ways. And then when we're thinking outputs, so Gilbert, you gave us a beautiful terrain of, you know, from reflective journals that are a part of the practice of being a student, a learner, a person in the city, a planner in practice, a planner in the classroom, and a planner in that journey. To blogs, to cartoons, to Heeten and Anna, you gave us some visualizations. I think, Belen, you gave us another layer, this, genres of urban design and architectural work. And what I saw there is not disciplinary distinctions, but actually this amazing spectrum and amazing opportunity to write about how do we express this stuff, how do we represent it, how do we insist on inserting it into an urban conversation. Okay, I can go on and on and on, but I really think these, what I heard are also in this learning. If I'm thinking about the provocation for the workshop, how do we learn this? How do we teach this? How do we think about practice in this space? How do we engage with urban equality, urban inequality, both in situating the classroom out in the city and insisting on that the city is the classroom, in doing it by design through studio work, and then in opening ourselves up to the vast array of ways in which we can do that. And I think there's so many interesting stories of both hope and inspiration, but also discomfort. I mean, we got a lot of different words for that. Places where students, the disjuncture from where we started with Poon and with you, with the disjuncture between rational planning and student experiential learning, from Heeten and Anna, from confusion, embracing confusion, giving us a language of experimentation, insisting on an imagination, and giving us different sorts of toolboxes for doing that. So I think there's really interesting stories of what, for me, when I'm listening to you, are all of these things in between. So in between this, like, sometimes useful, sometimes sort of almost too easy language of theory and practice, inside the classroom, outside the classroom, in the university, in the community. I think we could throw out lots and lots of those junctures in the state, maybe in Gilbert's, in SDI, in Shakdwellers, in the university, in the municipality, but in the betweens, there's all sorts of stuff. And I think I think that's what we need to write. So I have silly questions. They're not silly questions, but really, I think they're questions to open up that. And I heard lots of them from each of you. So maybe if you find a question here, which is one which you didn't really emphasize in your talk. I thought, Gilbert, you made a beautiful comment, and I could hear it in each of your presentations, that to do this work as a facilitator, as a teacher, is actually really, really demanding. When we're thinking urban inequality, what is something that what motivates you as someone driving and shaping this work, someone committed to doing this, to insisting that, to insisting on a space for this in the academy? So maybe you spoke about that, maybe you didn't, maybe that grabs you. I'd love to hear more about that. Is there something in the student learning? I think, we can get stuck in these binaries, but student learning, in looking at how students themselves articulate what they've learned, how they push forward. And I could see that in the quotes in Anna and Heeten, in your the parts that were on your initial presentation on just the cover page, and in the posters themselves. So what is it about student learning? Because I think if we look at that, we move forward. Okay, maybe Poonam, there's something that really strikes you in your work that is from the students' articulation of where they end up in this, or where they are somewhere in that. And maybe last one, and as importantly, is where's the theoretical traction? So for instance, Gilbert, when the grandma meets Feinstein, what is the grandma saying that gives you traction? So is there a space of theoretical traction that helps us dig into this language, which often becomes too generic, about urban inequality, urban justice, the good city? What in this work, and just if we can, and really to go back to this point about the inspiration for me listening to you, the inspiration to hear the stories, to hear the narratives, to hear the nitty-gritties of this, because I think in there is beautiful theoretical traction, beautiful learning, and those are the nuggets which help us go forward. Okay, I'm going to leave it there. That's a very open sort of set of invitations, but hopefully that kicks off the conversation. Thank you.
Cool. Thanks so much. And I'm just going to read out one of the questions that had come in the chat. And I don't know if I fully get it, but maybe Shailendra, you can write it again if I don't get it. But the question is, in circumventing the confrontation of self and value in transformational learning, how effective is the authoritative role, not as a confirmatory, rather as a facilitation. So I guess it's also like sort of linking to role as the facilitator. And thank you so much, Sophie, for all, like, for bringing this up, bringing this like sort of together so beautifully. And some of the questions that I was thinking through, you have already covered. So I'm just going to open it up for the speakers to sort of respond. And maybe Heeten, do you want to go first, since I know you are a little pressed for time, and if everybody is okay, if we can go over a little, if everybody is okay with that. I don't think we'll finish in the next 8 minutes. Okay.
I don't know, and I guess as a response, I mean, it's partly kind of, I guess, my interest in provocation, and I think, Sophie, you put forward something quite interesting there in terms of urban inequality, and I think that understanding is that it sits somewhere out there. We understand inequality in a very particular context, but what if we bring that sense of inequality into the spaces that we're working in, and understand the unequalness in terms of what we have, how we've had to teach things or learn things, and what is it about kind of bringing, like, making equal new methods. What kind of equities are we talking about, specifically when we look at how the urban is both understood, processed, and can we shift these words around teaching and learning to those things, like sort of processing to understanding? Is there a possibility to expand that language? And in that sense, that your kind of note to inequality, is very resonant to me. I really appreciate that. Yeah.
Who wants to go next? I mean, anybody? Should I?
Thanks. I can offer one or two.
Cool. Thanks, Gilbert.
Sure. Thanks, Sophie, for a wonderful reflection and bringing the conversation together so well. In terms of motivation or the drive behind it, well, I think this is maybe largely personal, if I may draw from the experience that I've been in for almost 7-8 years teaching these courses. I do think first is the training, where people train and how deeply immense they become in these methodologies. It is highly difficult. It's very difficult to get someone who has not gone through the process to actually teach these programs. They deep in immersion, particularly for myself, if I may reflect, use myself as an example, and I'm sorry for that, is I never did planning at bachelor's level, but I was so deeply immersed in these methodologies when I was doing planning a degree at master's level at University of Cape Town. I never knew I can actually teach this type of stuff. And eventually I became involved. And I discovered the nuances, the beauty of working with people in the communities and speaking a language that the ordinary person can understand. And to a large extent, being empathetic to the situation that we face while creating sufficient distance to look at things with a fair lens. I've seen among several colleagues beyond Zambia that have engaged on these methodologies. It is not an easy process. So it's empathetic, it's commitment to thinking in an alternative way and appreciating that there are alternative ways of knowing, and alternative ways of doing things, and also finding oneself quite entangled to justify certain methodologies within a university setup. I'm in a school of natural sciences where they do physics, chemistry, biology. And so when you talk of assessment without a 3-hour session, somebody remembering what they learned 3 months ago, and then you say, well, as we are learning and examining, and one of the assessors is a grandmother from an informal settlement where water is not supplied, they really don't appreciate that. So one needs to be a little bit assertive and ready to defend what they believe in as a correct methodology of doing things at the same time being open to alternative voices, so that these methodologies also undergo shifts as priorities in the cities as well shift, and as thinking and new knowledge gets published and shared. Yeah, something like that. So that's what I can say. It is indeed a great toll on time and marking those big reports from the communities and the student reports. The influence take on theoretical attractions. What I see here as something that we constantly engage with is we often depend, in teaching these materials, we often depend on planning theory courses, planning theory materials. Like in one of the courses, I use a lot on just sit ideas. But getting those theoretical materials into real practice again opens up alternative thinking and the limitations of participatory decision making in the context of deep inequalities and systematic entrenched disempowering systems and processes. And I think it is in those opportunity spaces that we need to continuously critique some of the mainline theoretical material that is available out there. And the other spaces, while we are talking of some, I do think we need to move further and go beyond the participation and begin to cherish ideas of co-creating the urban space, go beyond community ownership to community influence and community control, knowing that much of what we're teaching, if I may use again Lusaka as my site, is happening in an increasingly liberal environment where the market is increasingly getting strong and strong. And so it's getting systems and processes at a scale that can galvanize the voice, influence, and mobilize for change in some extent. And that really goes beyond conventional theoretical material of urban participatory city making and city governance. I can end there. Thanks.
Thanks, Gilbert. Len, do you want to go quickly? Sorry,
yes,
I know you only have 1 minute.
I already sent a message to my fellow colleagues, like I'm going to be 2 minutes late. But no, thank you, everyone. For me, this has been an amazing learning experience. I also think I do want to emphasize that sometimes, especially in the Global South where we work, this idea of elitism that arises from like an academic setting as felt by communities and people who do not have access to formal education. So I think there's also this struggle from us within academia, how to break those barriers and acknowledge different kinds of knowledges and recognize them as equally valid. But also in the idea of the strength or the power of the university to institutionalize those knowledges as well through capacity building. So the idea of like that our students are not only the ones that are taking our modules and classes, but that how do we engage with citizens alike and through just the possibility of giving them a certificate of participation in these workshops and practices, I think has an enormous value. So I think there's always within our own work, the idea of how to continuously evolve education and to make it more inclusionary as well. So I think this idea of the city as a learning platform involves necessarily breaking those, in our case, in the Catholic University in Peru, specifically material boundaries that engage the university campus and break them. And I think also understanding that city learning as a platform involves the idea of multidisciplinarity. And we tend to be working in the Faculty of Architecture and Urbanism, just speaking of the design field, but I think engaging with other fields to try to understand the complexity and the lived experiences of inequality also brings a lot of food on the plate. And I'm grateful that I have the opportunity as a teacher to be learning from multiple experiences of citizens, but also of other disciplines. And I think that is something that has emerged, at least in our case, rather recently. We tend to be more disciplinary in the last decade, or like, and now we're really engaging with this complexity, and I'm grateful for that. So yeah, thank you all. It was really lovely meeting you and hearing your experiences. I have a lot to learn from you.
Thanks so much, Belen.
Yeah. So let me just try and decode the question here before I go on to what Sophie had so, nicely articulated. So I think if I understand the question correctly, I think it means that if we are in a role as a facilitator, it will be easier for us to confront self and values. I don't know. That's what I'm kind of getting out of this question. And I think confrontation of self and value definitely in our role as a facilitators rather than as experts would definitely, it'll make it much easier for developing that kind of a self-awareness. So I don't know, Shalendra, maybe you can say whether this is what you meant. This is what I've understood from this question. Going to what Sophie was discussing about, and also just to share some of the experiences as to how students articulate the idea of equality. And I think for me, I kind of, when I go, so I take the studio, which is at a local area level, and also the first year studio, where the first task that we end up having is that students who come before last year, the students who used to come were coming from an entrance exam, which was, architecture, common with architecture. So they are ranking. So the students who were coming to planning were ranked. Usually they would come feeling that they haven't gotten admissions in architecture or in engineering, and they have landed up in planning. So the first year thus used to be, just making them see value because of this whole notion of the employability of the profession. So just to make them see value in what they were doing. And by the first semester, end of the semester or second semester, they could see the value, because it does give some kind of a meaning to them. Since last year, now we have managed to have a separate test for planning, which is separate from architecture, which kind of has really helped in a sense that students are no longer now ranked 1400 in architecture exam or something. They are ranked, as a separate planning distance. That's just something that I just wanted to share. The other thing that I kind of usually grapple a lot with is how I'm designing the problem. And some of the problems that we have picked up, for example, we picked up a problem where the court had given a certain judgment on the low-income housing as an entitlement of the communities. And so we picked up, that was an ongoing court case, and we picked that up. And I found that when students, they can see that their work is going to be connected well with, with the reality, and they're going to make a difference, some kind of a difference. Their engagement, then the efforts to engage them in the class was not much, because they really connected well with. So the recent exercises that we've had, there is a Delhi master plan process going on, which is, the draft master plan. So we picked up issues which concerned with low income housing, or, how land, the equity in terms of this distribution of land as a resource, how it gets reflected in the policies. And those are the discomfort comes because there is this whole larger environment which is real estate oriented. There are development, and they hear that in their everyday life, let's have these very glamorous kind of buildings. And then they come to the studio where we kind of push them into thinking which is not the the dominant thinking. And then the satisfaction is that they start with that kind of an orientation, but by the end of the semester, there is a shift, and they're able to see that. They're able to see, so that is very satisfying, particularly. And I'll give an example of that, in which Geetika was also in that studio. So there was this student in the second semester, and he was like saying, we had the studio during the COVID time. We kind of the central idea we were exploring was this whole idea of vulnerability. How different groups are vulnerable, how do we see vulnerability in our everyday lives. And there was this kid, and he kind of says that, so I have this help who comes to my house, and she lives in a slum. So I just kind of asked him, I said, if we were to see it from her perspective, would she still see her house as a slum? And he was like, I think it struck with him. And then he kind of took that thought, and he talked to his various people he talked to, and by the end of the semester, in his final jury, he really presented it from the perspective of the help that was coming to his house. And it was a moment which kind of, where you see that how the student has just moved and developed a certain kind of a sensibility towards the whole idea of equality. So we use this whole, journal, Gilbert also mentioned. So we use the practice of, learning journal, where you're reflecting on some of the thoughts, which also helped us understand the social context in which the students were coming from. And that gave us a certain insight into the struggles that they were kind of having at their homes, in their, the way. So those, I think with some of those, the one thing which, I kind of experimented with this, taking students to communities in a participatory studio. And that's a dilemma that I haven't yet been able to resolve. So what happens is that students come out after the studio is over. And the communities are left kind of in the sense that we have taken from the communities, and the communities do not really get things back. So there is always this dilemma whether, how do I introduce this whole participatory process in which either I have a long-term engagement with the communities, or so while we did that, but that I still have that dilemma. I don't know how to resolve it. So sometimes I use role plays or other kind of things, but I do take them to communities, and maybe we kind of invite them for their final. So sometimes we invite them for the final presentation, but still, so the problem is that over a period of time, communities are disenchanted. When we go there, they say that, you keep in some areas, we keep going back there, but nothing changes for them. And that becomes an issue for me in studios. So with that, I think I'll thank you for this really, really very, very fascinating work that all of you showed. Really, a lot of things for me to take back and absorb and process. Thank you.
Thank you. Anna, do you want to come in? And then I'll hand back to Sophie.
Thank you. Yes, just briefly, perhaps. Thank you, Sophie, for those wonderful questions. And, these are conversations that we've been having over the years, but it's really nice to think about them in the context of other studios. I'll start with something that relates very well to what you just said, Poonam, about students' learning experience and that shift that happens. So I think Heeten and I have the luxury really of the fact that we are one module among the four, or well, three that are really practical, your CRS1 and then CRS3, which engage in equality much more heads-on. And so we don't have to worry in a way about taking on that responsibility of teaching students, quote unquote, to deal with that. But what we can do and what we feel responsible about is how we can give them in different ways across the different studios, but how can we give them a lens on themselves as knowers? And so how, the ideal outcome then for us as facilitators is if someone starts to see the city differently or feel the city differently, like your student Poonam, or I mean, this is an example that Geetika and Sophie will be familiar to you, but we had a student who said she had never been attentive to the smells of the city before. And in that year when we focused on the different senses, she said, now I can smell, and I sit into the minibus taxi and I start from Mowbray and I come to the city center, and the smells change as I go. And that already says so much about the topography and the aesthetics of the city. So if we are able to have graduates who become aware as knowers, and then add that awareness to all the practical forms of engagement that they learn in the other studios, I think then we achieve something of the goal of the program, of just pushing the epistemology of what urbanisms from the South can be. And maybe this is how I will move on to what you asked us about the theoretical traction. Being fortunate enough to do this alongside teaching urban theory or co-teaching it with Edgar, I think one of the big questions often is, we talk about how Southern urbanism needs to be attentive to the affective, to the aesthetic. So as we move away from the kinds of or the modes of traditional ways of knowing the city, but there often isn't a way to flesh that out. And it remains abstract. So then in the studio, when we engage through arts-based methods, we can do a little bit of that fleshing out. So when we invite artists to talk about their practice and show students how they as artists see the city and how they work with the city as a reference material, then that really helps them to think, oh, this gives me an idea about what it means to bring in the aesthetic. This gives me an idea of what it means to integrate into thinking inequality what the aesthetic represents. So for me, that is one of the major theoretical anchors there, or connections. And I really fully agree with you, and you won't be surprised by that on how we need to problematize this theory practice binary, because we all are embedded in our different curriculums for better or worse, right? And so we engage that continuum always in productive ways in these studios. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Anna. Sophie, do you want to?
Oh, I just want to say thank you, guys. That was so interesting. It was like another layer of your talks, and yeah, so productive and beautiful. And I just, listening to you, I mean, for those of you who know me, I'm like a broken record, but I think this work is an imperative. We have to do it. It's totally fundamental. But then it's also, building off of what you just said, Anna, it's an invitation, and we have an invitation to embrace it and do it in so many ways. And listening to everybody, I think it's piecing together those ways, it as a collective practice that is where, where we get to be ourselves, find our niche, do our thing, Gilbert, just as you said, follow those journeys, the pathways that make sense to us, but then, bringing it together, and it's bringing together, it breaks and pushes forward our practice. I think for students it's fundamental, but for me as somebody in this field, it's just so crucial. So thank you. I will stop right there. Let me hand it back to Geetika.
Thank you so much. Yeah, and I just want to take just last 30 seconds to say thanks to everyone, and really, I'm really happy to see this panel coming together. Actually, I'm hoping that we can aim to write this up and also then share it further, because there are so many thoughts that are coming together. And yeah, I'll just end there and hand over to Tanvi.
Yeah, thank you everybody for joining, to all the speakers and to all the participants who were here. A recording of this session will be available on the IIHS YouTube channel soon. And do continue to follow us on our social media platforms for more information on our research, publications, and talks. Thanks everybody. Have a good evening.